This isn't the preoccupation of your life, but it's of such profound and interest to people. I'm of an age where I was 10 or 11 years old when the Beatles first came to America, and I listened to, like so many people, all their records, watched all of their comings and goings, and as we prepared for this event today, I revisited some of my thinking around that. We all knew every lick, we all knew every lyric, and as a result, the Beatles had an enormous power over us, and it was generally a positive power. And the particular element of it that we wanted to talk about today in the context of social entrepreneurship and the things we've been talking about, they seem to have had an early and innate gift among their many gifts for understanding that they had power that went beyond the music and that they could connect that power to social causes. When did you first see this in your relationship with them?
I'm not sure, because it all evolved so much. But I mean, I thought that when Mike Holtzman asked me to do this, Mike and I are business partners for a long time, and he explained to me the point of this conference, and one realized actually that's what some of the things that we did very early on, and maybe certainly role players in that area. I should probably start off by explaining to a lot of people, especially people who choose to be at the back, that we were talking about a long time ago when the world was very different. And not only from a communication point of view, but also the music world in those days was American. There was no real popular music outside the United States, and the rest of the world bought American music. There were limits, of course, in most of the European countries on how much they could play American music, because the unions wouldn't let them. They call needle time. And so what happened with the Beatles, when they became so successful, it did actually change the world. I mean, we can get into more detail as you ask your questions, but I mean, it did change the world because the music business was obliged to change the world. And their success, which didn't happen overnight, which often people think it was, so we were able to, as a result of being successful and changing the world, we were able to think about our responsibilities and how we handle ourselves.
And was that a conscious process? We've got this platform. Can we mobilize and do something important beyond the music?
Well, I think that the background really there, and Mike Elliott will hopefully support me on this, is the fact that Liverpool was an extraordinary city. It was had been the largest port in Europe. It was declining. There was a lot of people unemployed. There was a lot of people unhappy. But also, there's an element of young guys. If you came from a working class background and you were young, you went to sea, you went to become a merchant seaman, where you made a decent amount of money. You didn't spend it because you were on the boat and so forth. And then after a few years of that, you came back and you got married. But these boys, as they were boys, actually, one of the main places they came to on their merchant seamen was the United States. So they knew more about Liverpool, knew more about pop music and American music as it evolved than anywhere else, any other city probably in the world outside the United States. So that was part of what Liverpool was a different place. It was, as I say, predominantly working class. We all were aware of the difficulties of social structures. And so it wasn't that unnatural for us to be sensitive to that kind of thing. And we're also talking about the United Kingdom in the 60s, which was a government which was left-leaning. Right, Mike? Thank you.
Well, that's, I think part of the appeal of the Beatles, was more than just their music. It was their personalities and their styles and their approaches. But I think it was, they were underdogs. In some way or other, we all saw ourselves in them, and they were working class lads. And
with a sense of humor.
I'm sorry?
With a sense
with
of
a sense of humor.
Yeah.
A sense of humor was very, very important. Tell me about, have you got a good story about their sense of humor around their fame and this subject?
Well, I mean, there's many, particularly John Lennon's kind of one-liners, but I mean, I think that the thing is that Liverpool in Britain is known for having a sort of tight sense of humor, which with a lot of sarcasm involved, which is where they accelerated in. I mean, there's one that Mike just mentioned to me just before lunch about when they were asked to do the Royal Command performance, which is a big deal, a concert in Britain, which still goes on every year, and usually the monarch comes to it. But it's sort of John did say, he said, well, thank you for all the applause. Now you people, what was the word? Clap with the people upstairs clap and the people downstairs shake their jewelry. I mean, that was like a, kind of thing. That was one of John's frequent things. But I mean, what happened was that when Brian signed them, he saw the talent in them, and he saw that, and they were sort of impressed by him because he was a successful businessman. So they were bright and they realized that he could help. And so we were very much a family situation. He managed, with little difficulty, getting them a record contract. I mean, everyone turned them down. Mm-hmm. And then eventually that happened. And then eventually the record started to sell. This is only in Britain and then in Europe. And America didn't want to know about it because America was the source of music. We didn't need anything from anywhere else. And but suddenly, after about almost like 18 months, almost more, it started to break in America. And the idea was that perhaps they should come to America. And by the time we made the commitment, by the time we arrived in '64, February, and they did the Ed Sullivan Show, which you may not know was a very big show on a Sunday night. It was live on CBS, and it was the biggest variety entertainment show. And they were asked to be on it. By the time we arrived in America, their record had gone to #1. They started off at the bottom of the bill, and they were accelerated to number, which was the thing. And the statistics show that night, 72 million people were watching, which I don't know what the population of America was at that time.
It was 200 million-ish, but there were 3 major networks and, only so many televisions. It's a remarkable market share.
That showed us that we were a bit different. But being Liverpudlian and not being too big-headed is a case of, this is today, what do we do tomorrow? Mm-hmm. So the story, as it evolved, was you're only as good as what you did today. And so let's work very hard at it and the benefits that we get. I'll dwell on some of these things because a lot of people will not know. Nobody had ever played stadiums before. People played concert halls or large halls. We were the first people to play stadiums. We had choices. We went around the country on a private plane. It was extraordinary, the change, but of course we were in the vanguard, so this was uncharted territory. So we were very concerned that we were making mistakes or that we would spoil everything, and we were very, very careful about all of those kind of things, and who our audience was. Of course, we were at the same time in the mid-60s. America was going through a very difficult period as well. You know, a couple of years before, a year before, just over a year before John Kennedy had been assassinated, you had an unpopular war on your hands. Young people were beginning to say, and then that disaster which happened at Kent University, you know, there's all of these things. So America itself was changing. And to their great credit, they liked the Beatles. And they liked the attitude, and they liked the sort of message that was being created. But we were sort of in the vanguard of that and of social change, and I think we appreciated that maybe we could do something to help and change as we went along.
Well, one of the sort of standout social cause leverage points that we all remember iconically was the Give Peace a Chance experience with John and Yoko. What do you remember about that?
Well, that's jumping ahead a bit. I mean, I'll go back.
I was going there just because of the reference to the war, but
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was a bit towards the end of the story. I mean, there's a point where a little earlier than that.
Yeah.
Which was the summer of '67, which was the summer of the Sgt. Pepper. And I really come back to how we changed, because '66, the Beatles, we did a world tour, and we started in Germany. We did 3, Munich and Essen and Hamburg, and then we went to Japan. When we went to Japan, there was a threat of assassination of the Beatles because we were a product of everything that Japan hated about the Western world, and we personified this evilness, and we were also playing the concerts in a respected and revered old concert hall. So it was a serious problem. They 4 Beatles were not allowed to leave the hotel, and there were not just police, the army was there. And then our next stop was the Philippines, where you may remember a woman called Mrs. Marcos, who was the wife of the dictator, and she invited us to lunch there. And Brian's had a rule that we didn't go anywhere when we were working, which wasn't part of our work rule, because we couldn't then control it, which was the right thing to do. And we didn't go, and we were, it was always all on television that we'd been rude to the president, and she had the place. It wasn't lunch for us, she filled the place with children. It would have been wrong for us to be there. Anyway, all our security was removed. We were, some of our party was beaten up at the airport. It was a hideous time. And when we got back to England, there was this great scandal, which was very important to us, is that John had given an interview to a woman that he knew very well as a reporter. And one of the things that he said about where they were at this point in time, the Beatles, he was being sarcastic and saying, you know, we're more popular than Jesus Christ.
Oh, yeah.
Which he was saying, isn't that ludicrous? But when it was repeated in America, a lot of people who were of religious mind.
My mother-in-law to this day.
Right. They were very angry, and they burned the Beatles records. And that subsequent tour in August, we were very, very scared that somebody was going to take a pot shot at them on stage. And so that was one of the reasons that it was decided they didn't need to tour anymore. Another first that we did was the fact that subsequent to the Ed Sullivan show and so forth, he wanted us to come back. And the policy Brian decided, was that we can't do those kind of things more. It's too difficult. So what we did is we filmed promotional films of the individual singles and so forth, and sent it to Ed Sullivan, who would normally have rejected it because it was a live program, but because it was the Beatles, he played it. And this, I think, was the forerunner of MTV as we know today. We were doing promotional, and it was before tape, so we were doing it on film. So that was another thing which we sort of started in our trying to change, make life simpler. But in the following, we decided not to ever tour again, that they would do, and they were given the freedom that they never had before of taking their time in writing and producing a record. Before, all of the records they'd done there, up to then, which was about 5, they had to be squeezed in between the touring dates and so forth. So Sgt. Pepper was exceptional because they had this freedom to do this. And so it was a big deal. It was, again, it was a mind-changing album, the first concept album. But we were doing nothing. But getting to your sort of getting to your point.
No. Well, I realized I skipped forward. It would be sort of in that time
summer,
frame. Yeah.
That summer when they had not made any appearances at all, and everything, the record had come out. I was approached by the CEO of the BBC, and he told me that Brian was away, and he told me that they were going to make a link up around the world, a live link up, which was unthinkable because, of course, there was it wasn't wireless. It had to go through cable all the way around the world under the sea and across nations and so forth. And that had to be live, and they were going to start off with Australia and come all the way around. And the BBC wanted the Beatles to be the last act on the show. And we weren't sure that we wanted to do this. We didn't think what was the point, and we liked to do things which had a point. And then we all agreed, or they agreed when we sat down and talked, that maybe this was a wonderful opportunity to send a message to the world, not to be too clever about it, but this was an opportunity. And so we said yes. And then the BBC came back and said, well, they were a bit worried about technology, and if it didn't work, maybe they should record it first. And John said, but the whole point is, it's live. Why are we going to record something which is going to go around the world live? And so we compromised, and they did a backing track, which was recorded. But John insisted that the vocal tracks were live, and that was All You Need Is Love. And that was the message that they thought was appropriate to go around the world.
Wow.
And it did go around the world. So
that was in 67.
That was July 67.
Remarkable. And then what? What was next?
Well, the next thing, sadly...
I mean, we've got concerts in stadiums, flying in private jets, inventing music television. I don't think anyone would argue with that. The movies continued that.
Well, we'd also done 3 major movies.
Right.
Yeah. 2 major movies at that time. Well, sadly, what happened at that summer is also Brian Epstein died. And so it was a great shock to all of us because we were family, and the main kind of father figure of the family had died. And everyone looked at each other and said, well, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. And I was one that given the job of putting the thing together. But also, this was a point where they decided that we were going to form this rather unique company. And we would put a lot of money into this company, and we would try to develop artists. We would try to develop people who had talent that wouldn't necessarily easily fit into the average business, so that we would be more understanding or more flexible, and so forth, and that we could help this. They were very rich by this time, and there was a lot of money, and this is their way of responding to the primarily the younger generation, but not just in the United Kingdom, anywhere. And so the thing, of course, the main difficulty with when you form anything new is what the hell do you call it? This is always a very difficult thing. And Paul came up with the idea of A is for Apple, we're going to call it Apple. So we did call it Apple, and at that point I wasn't quite sure what we were going to do, because it was very open. We knew we were going to help people and we were going to be considerate and so forth, but in what areas we were not quite sure about. So I went to our American lawyer, who was a very special man, and I said to him, I want you to cover me in all areas of the major around the world in music, recordings, music publishing, book publishing, films, television. I want to be protected. They are our Apple product. And he obviously did a very, very good job, because many years later, a man called Steve Jobs was developing a company called Apple. Our company was called Apple Core. And his company ended up, as he developed and was doing different things, his company then bumped up against the Beatles' Apple. And he couldn't pursue areas that he wanted to pursue because we had protected them and we copyrighted them. And this caused a terrible problem with him. He didn't like it. And
he was always reasonable and sensible.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, in this case, the Beatles had the upper hand, and they said, and he ended up by having to pay them a very, very, very considerable amount of money.
A golden touch, to be sure. So we're now, what year are we in?
Well, yes, okay, so now we're going to 68, and we start a new record company called Apple. And the first album was the Double White Album. By this time, Yoko had been on the scene. And this was made life a bit different for everyone, because up until now you had 4 guys, young guys, who had experienced a lot together. They'd experienced poverty, very difficult circumstances. Then they got a big problem of being so famous. That was also created a lot of problems. But they were like 4 brothers. They were together. And what happens, of course, with any families, you grow up, you get married, and you have children of your own, and you're not quite as tight as you used to be. And John, of course, has started this off. Everyone tried to adjust, but it was not always easy. And John and Yoko were very strong personalities too. And they had their agenda. And I think John was, they were together, to be fair to Yoko. They were, of course, aware of the fact that they could use that money for good causes. So when the advertising that they took up, like the war is over, this was going the old-fashioned route of going to Madison Avenue and say, we want you to sell for us. So we use that old-fashioned route to our best purposes.
There was outdoor advertising, as I recall.
Fantastic, which actually Yoko still does. I mean, just recently, she was a whole page in the New York Times and the Washington Post. What was it? Fracking.
Yeah.
How evil fracking was.
Well, I think that sort of the first time that any of us were made aware of, this sort of social activism was, back to my question from a few minutes ago, was there sleep in and the Give Peace a Chance initiative. We all, of course, felt that Yoko was the devil at this point because she'd been demonized, here in the States at least, to some degree by the press. So it was the first kind of look we really had at them.
Well, I mean, a lot of people do now know about her, but I mean, she was a respected artist in her own right. She left her family, who were very affluent Japanese family, and come to America and established herself as an artist in the early 60s. And she's a very determined, interesting woman. John, that's what John liked about her. You know, he thought it was just great, and it fitted his reason. He wanted to do something different, and he appreciated what she was doing. The other three Beatles tried to compromise. They tried to be understanding, but it wasn't always easy. And actually, frankly, John and Yoko didn't always make it very easy for them. But then we had Paul had married to Linda Eastman, who I actually introduced them to each other. She was a friend of mine. And then John decided that he was going to get married to Yoko, which gave me a lot of other problems because I had to get him divorced from his wife and Yoko divorced from her husband, which wasn't easy. And
it's hard enough when you do it for yourself, doing it for someone else.
And then so John says, how do we get married without causing a lot of attention? Well, frankly, there wasn't one. I examined all kinds of legal ways, and in England, even if you get a special license, it still has to have a 48-hour notice. So that would blow that. And anyway, I eventually, through our lawyers, found out that as a British citizen, you can get married in Gibraltar, which is a British possession, with no notice. So I called John up, which is, there's a song, there's a lyric which says, Peter Brown called to say you can make it okay. You can get married in Gibraltar near Spain. And so we met in Gibraltar. We went to the governor's office and said, marry them. And then we got back on the plane and flew to Paris, and then they decided that they were going to do the bed-in, and they went to Amsterdam. And that got a lot of attention.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah. And then they did another one in Toronto, which got a lot of attention, because John, of course, at that point, couldn't come into America because he had a drug bust. And it took a while to get around that. And then he decided that their favorite place was New York. And they moved to New York very happily. And then, of course, he and she got very supportive of the revolution that was happening in the early 60s, 70s, and the height of the anti-war campaign and so forth. And that he jumped in on that very much, but that had to be sort of softened a bit because the then Nixon administration saw him as a real nuisance, and they were trying to get him out of America. So we had to calm down his
profile
until he got his green card.
Well, it's fascinating. It's amazing to think, as you said a few moments ago, how long ago that was. Still, it's just 10 years into that story.
But I think that what we've been talking about here today is, that sort of, we was trying in a sort of uneducated way to do what you're doing here, is to try and improve situations in the world. If you're in a position where you can help, step up, and as I say, none of these things that we've been talking about today were in existence in those days.
No.
And so we didn't quite know where to go or how to go about it, but we tried whatever we could.
We were talking, and none of us had ever heard of Bangladesh before 1971 with George, and I said before, we all knew every lick, every lyric. In the film and in the song, he says something. My friend said to me, with sadness in his eyes, I really need some help before my country dies. Although I couldn't feel the pain, I knew I had to try. And now we're asking all of you to help us save some lives. So all of us, we were ignited because we we hung on every word. We had Beatlemania. And as the Beatles had begun to come apart, George called on that energy.
George, it was an amazing thing that he did. I mean, it did it with great sincerity. And the fact that they organized it, because this was a first, again, nobody had ever actually done a concert like this before. And it was done in Madison Square Garden. And he just got on the phone and he got his mates to come, Eric and everyone. And it was unique and it made money. I mean, so many of these things, if you don't know what you're doing, you can be very expensive and you end up by not having much left. That made a nice chunk of money, and it went to Bangladesh.
And it still does. I bought the video a few days ago, and it indicates that there's still the strong connection back to the money raised from the music. And you went to that concert?
Yes, I did. I was living in New York at that time, and I went in. It was in the summer. I was out at the Long Island, and we drove in, and it was extraordinary.
It was, we've come to, by the way, Bono, who I don't know as well as Mike Elliott does, obviously, but he is as knowledgeable about these things as anyone. He's modeled so much of his career and his life off of off of his fan, being their number one fan. But to think that it was really the first time before Bob Geldof or before Farm Aid, before Michael Jackson, any of it. The Beatles and George, in this case, did that. It was really quite remarkable.
And as you say, playing it just before, it made me think, it really was good.
It was good, yeah.
So I did also, while we're on George's subject, is that there was a memorial for George at the Royal Albert Hall in England, and that is very good, too. I watched it with Mike and his brother, what was it, like 3 years ago? Yeah. And if everyone hadn't seen it, it's like, it starts off with Ravi Shankar, then it has the, Monty Python, the group doing their number, which George, interesting, George loved movies and everything, and he had a film company, and they'd originally, the Monty Python movies were made by George's production company. So they were great friends with his. And then, so you had Monty Python, you had Ravi, and then you had a whole collection of very, very well-known pop stars, musicians. And all of them were only allowed to sing one song. And it was organized by Eric and George's son. And I thought it was wonderful, so I'd recommend that to anyone else who's interested in.
We were talking about this last night. It's called The Concert for George, and there's a mind-blowing performance by Eric Clapton and an all-star band of While My Guitar Gently Weeps that I dare anyone to watch without a tear coming to their eye. Just very, very beautiful. Did you stay in touch with George through the years?
Yes, mainly because I was sort of in love with his wife, who is the most fabulous person, and I still see a lot of her.
He was good about that. Eric Clapton was in love with his wife.
She married him after George. Yeah. I stayed in touch, and I stayed in touch more or less with Ringo and with Paul. But John and I were neighbors. He was living in the next building to me in New York, so we saw quite a lot of each other, and I still see Yoko very regularly. And she is, she's a good friend. She's a good person to have as a friend. She's slightly mellowed, but she's still a very, very determined woman.
And like you, a very good New Yorker.
Thank you.
She's associated with wonderful causes and the fabric of the art and thinking community of New York. And
I've discovered most of the time by accident that she's very philanthropic, and she sends money to places anonymously. I mean, well, not anonymously, but on the understanding that it's not publicized, that she's sending money. And so she's done that. We are involved with an organization called Autism Speaks, which is, as we all know recently, autism is a very big problem in the entire world. And we managed to get the United Nations to create an Autism Day. Prior to this, they had only, in their entire history of the UN, they had only given 2 days, but one was diabetes and one was AIDS. And we convinced them that they should declare an Autism Day, which is on the 2nd of April, coming up. And she was very, very helpful with us and did a design thing of a jigsaw puzzle with one piece missing and everything. And
that was her design.
That was her design.
Familiar with that. It's their logo, really. It's just become the logo of Autism Speaks.
Yeah. And so those kind of things that she doesn't make any fuss, but she does it.
On behalf of everyone here, Peter, I thank you. It's such a special pleasure and treat to do this. Thank you so very much.
Well,